Hello and welcome to National Invasive Species Awareness Week 2023. My name is Elizabeth Brown and I serve as your Government Relations Director here at NISAW. Thank you for joining us today for our fourth webinar this week, collaboratively addressing feral swine wild pigs and preparing for African Swine Fever across North America. This truly a landmark event is the first time we've had representatives from Canada, the US, and Mexico all in a single webinar. Thank you to the Washington Invasive Species Council sponsor the event, helping to organize it. Next, I will invite our speaker, Michael Mullo, Assistant Program Manager with US Department of Agriculture's National Feral Swine Damage Management Program, to get us started with an overview of feral swine.
Great, thank you. Glad to be here, and I'll jump right in. Most of us are probably aware and have heard feral swine referred to in a variety of names. There's a variety of names for feral swine across the United States and North America, but by any name, wild swine, feral swine, wild hogs. Swine were not native to North America. They were first brought to the North American continent by early explorers in the early 1500s primarily, and they were let loose across the landscape to act as a ready food supply during the early colonization and exploration. And throughout that period, they lived a pretty much benign experience. But over the past 30 years, we've seen somewhat of an explosion of pigs. And so the map here represents what the influence of the early colonization was. Pigs throughout the southeastern United States, Florida, Texas, over into where the Spanish eventually colonized in California. And like I said, in the last 3 to 4 decades, we saw quite a increase in swine across the landscape of the United States. And so what we see now is pigs that weren't necessarily part of this colonization. And when we compare, you can see it's pretty profound. We've got distant pigs that aren't necessarily connected to what would be natural movement. So what is the cause of this? And so we know that some of it is indeed natural expansion of these existing populations. But we also know that there's escapees of domestic swine and escapes from hunting operations, Eurasian wild boar and hybrids. And so it's a combination of that. But that's not really what we think that the mass exodus of this expansion was a result of. We find that it was primarily an intentional release of animals to establish hunting populations across the widespread parts of the United States. And so as a result, we see presently well over 6 million pigs across more than 30 states in the United States. And if you couple that with what we've seen recently in Canada, and as these maps represent the spread of pigs from 1990 to 2017, quite an expansion, much like we've seen in the United States. Little different history, but still the same, quite an expansion. And then you compare that also with pigs along the southern border of the United States and the northern parts of Mexico, and you recognize we certainly have a widespread problem across all of North America. And so I say problem, and so you might think, feral swine, why do we care? First of all, the International Union for Conservation of Nature accurately describes feral swine as probably the world's worst invasive species. Certainly huge impacts across basically everything. They impact agriculture through rooting, consumption of crops. We see impacts to natural resources, which can lead to damage to not only fields and plant life, but also water quality. So certainly an impact to natural resources, competition with our native species. We see impacts with human health and safety, certain zoonotic diseases such as swine brucellosis, but also risk of attack in some situations by feral swine. And pigs in a neighborhood could certainly harbor risk to young children as sows might try to protect their young. And then we see impacts to property, cemeteries, golf courses, turf lawns, and also certainly widespread. And feral swine are not only a problem, but there's a challenging problem. They're omnivores, meaning they eat most anything, highly adaptable, very intelligent animal. Some of the challenges we face are that they reproduce at an early age, and they have up to 2 litters per year, basically exponential growth. Very sociable animal. Sometimes we use that to our advantage in how we capture animals. And then boars especially have large home ranges, so very widespread, but quite a challenging foe. In response to that, how do we go about dealing with this? Well, the United States purposely developed a national strategy to manage feral swine. And through congressional appropriations in 2014, funding was provided to us to implement a collaborative national feral swine management program, primarily focused in states where there was a recognized feral swine population, but also to serve as an attempt to keep states from gaining feral swine, so to speak. And so as a result of this collaborative pursuit, the appropriation funding went to develop the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program, to which most of us in this call today are a part of. But our goal is primarily to minimize damage caused by feral swine to all these different issues that I've mentioned. We do that through the pursuit of eliminating feral swine in states where populations are low or newly emerging. But we also try to reduce feral swine numbers in those states where the numbers are high as an effort to minimize damage. And it's not only the pursuit of total eradication, but to minimize and offset some of the constant damage that some of our farmers see in areas where the populations are high, and it may be somewhat ambitious to talk about eradication at this point. Our program achieves its goals primarily through cooperative partnerships. It's very important. I know that's part of this forum today, is how our collaborative efforts are working. And so our program certainly relies upon these cooperative relationships. And so when you look at from a state level, I've listed here a number of those types of relationships that we have. Our program is quite successful through partnering with departments of agriculture, natural resource commissions, universities, game and fish commissions, parks and tourism. So just a wide gamut of cooperators that make this program what it is. And it's very important that we maintain and have those cooperative and collaborative relationships. From a national perspective, we work with another myriad of federal agencies, not only U.S. Department of Agriculture, but Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Defense. We have relationships with the National Bureau of Investigation, National Park Service. And so it's very important that we maintain these collaborative and cooperative efforts. To date, we are seeing progress. We've had 7 state eliminations. We've worked towards eliminating swine in 4 other states, where we're monitoring those states now to ascertain that we indeed are in a free state before we declare those eliminated. But we've moved 18 states from a higher level of population status to at least a lower level. So you can see we are certainly making this. And so when we think about progress, we get excited by that. But we're constantly recognizing from articles such as this, and we are making progress, but as these 2 articles that were just published in the last 2 weeks represent, they remind us that we still have a long ways to go. Undoubtedly, our success in eliminating invasive species such as feral swine, it will necessitate a continued collaborative effort. And even across international borders, as the one article alludes to, potential threats from Canada. And so it's very important that we maintain these collaborative efforts and work together as we pursue a solution to the continued threat of feral swine across North America. I'm looking forward to the rest of this webinar today, and I hope that we can all learn from the collaborative efforts that are taking place across North America. With that, I know we have a component at the end where I'll be able to field questions. But I hope that was informative and was a good start to what we continue to hope to show the collaborations as we move forward.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great introduction to our webinar today. We appreciate that overview. All right, let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Wayne Lees, coordinator for Squeal on Pigs Manitoba. His presentation is titled Wild Pigs, a One Health Threat.
Thanks very much for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this North American-wide seminar. We've called this a One Health threat in terms of wild pigs are not just a threat to other pigs, they're a threat to other animal species, so they have an impact on animal health. They can have an impact on human health from both injury and the spread of disease. And they certainly have an impact on environmental health. So we tend to look at this as being a holistic problem that requires a holistic solution. What's really prompted the interest in controlling wild pigs, the threat of African swine fever. African swine fever started in Kenya in about the mid-1920s and then spread throughout Africa a little bit. But it really started to gain some interest when it spread into Eastern Europe and then finally into China and Southeast Asia in 2018. And so far, the only place in the Western Hemisphere that's actually had African swine fever is Haiti. The reason that African swine fever is so important is that it's a DNA virus disease that's highly resistant in the environment. It can be spread through meat products and that sort of thing. It can persist in very cold weather. It causes very high mortality and morbidity in the swine population. It can incubate for up to 3 weeks. So you can actually have it in a group of pigs without actually recognizing it for a while. And it will cause a significant impact on the ability to trade in pork and pork products. I would liken it to the impact that BSE had on trade in cattle products a couple of decades ago. So why is this important? If you look when it spread into China, China has probably about half of the world's pigs. And so spreading in China impacts a huge proportion of the world's pork supply. And some people have estimated that from 25 to 30% of the world's pig population was affected by African swine fever. So it's a significant disease economically. It's a significant disease that could impact our food supply. Wild pigs have been called an ecological train wreck. I didn't coin that term, but I certainly like to use it because they have an impact in many areas, not just the impact on the environment, but they're a reservoir for many diseases. And I've listed off an alphabet soup of acronyms here. Some of these diseases will affect pigs. Some of them will affect other animal species. Some of them will affect human health. So these animals can carry diseases throughout from one area to another and from one species to another. The big problem, though, is that it's not just pigs that become affected. Cattle producers can be affected by tuberculosis or brucellosis. The crop and forage damage has been already covered, but I'll show you a few pictures of that in our part of the world. And then the ecosystem health, they will destroy habitat and vulnerable species. And then, of course, there's the public safety aspect. And it's already been covered that they actually have no natural predators and they reproduce very quickly. So here's a few photos from Manitoba. And so the one on the left is a pasture where wild pigs have been rooting, and you can see the damage that they do. The other one is a cornfield where they've been going in, trampling the corn and eating the cobs. Here's another actual picture of wild pigs, a little bit too close for comfort, I think, in terms of their proximity to people. So it's not a theoretical issue, it's a real issue. So our approach has been that we've managed to use the Squeal on Pigs campaign that's been generously offered and adapt it to the Manitoba situation. And this has been a very, very successful public relations campaign for us. The wild pig issue is what I call a wicked problem. These are problems where everyone's issue, but nobody's responsibility. And wild pigs seem to fit into those categories. It falls between the cracks. Is it an agricultural issue? Is it a natural resources issue? Doesn't really matter. It has to be solved. And there's no simple solution. And so this requires a really collaborative and holistic approach to the problem. So in we've undertaken to incorporate under the Manitoba Pork Council. We actually manage the program, but we have partners within the provincial government, Manitoba Agriculture and Natural Resources, with the federal government, with Parks Canada, and then we coordinate field operations with a small group of very dedicated people. a big part of the Squeal on Pigs campaign has been encouraging people to report sightings. And this is just a brief screenshot of the way that people can actually report to us on our website of when they've seen pigs, where they've seen them, and that sort of thing. And this has allowed us then to get a really good handle on how the current situation is working. So this is a map of the bottom half of our province. And so off to the right will be Ontario, and off to the left will be Saskatchewan, and down to the bottom will be United States border. So you can see here where most of the sightings have been in this area, which is a south central part of the province. But we've actually had sightings much further north into the boreal forest areas. And these are areas of concern because eliminating wild pigs in those situations will be much more difficult. So one of the tools that we've been using extensively have been trail cameras, and these are cell phone enabled trail cameras. So we set these up, and from a cell phone, our field manager can then check the pictures on each camera without actually having to go and physically visit it. And this has been a great tool for us to be able to check a large area very quickly. And here's some of the photos, obviously, that you can see, one in the daylight, one in the evening, but these trail cameras have been a really good adjunct to when people report a sighting. We'll set up a trail camera, we'll set out some bait, and then see if pigs actually come to it. We've also managed to incorporate a drone. This is a thermal imaging drone. And so we've used this then to record, get into areas that would be very difficult to access by foot. So on the left here is a picture of some cattle on pasture. And then on the right is the thermal image of those same animals. And you can see that they really do light up. And so this is an excellent tool that we've just started to use to be able to find out where pigs are and screen an area. We've had to modify some of the trapping methodologies. We've adapted the baiting system to our climate. We use fermented corn and jello powder and then start to bait an area to attract the pigs. And then this is a shot of a mobile trap. And some of the technologies that work in a warmer climate don't work here. It's really hard to pound T-posts into frozen ground. So we've used these corral traps and modified them with frames and a simplified trigger system to work in winter conditions. One of the things that I think is really important is if you were to look at the world from a pig's point of view, this is what you would see. You don't see borders, you don't see provinces or states, and you don't see international boundaries. By adopting a collaborative cross-border approach is really the only way that we're going to be able to attack this problem and get a handle on it. It's going to be really important not just to have the collaboration within our own jurisdiction, but across jurisdictions. Just to sum up, wild pigs are recognized as invasive in Canada. Our goal is to eradicate them. It's going to be a long-term goal, but we're starting. Methodologies that work in warmer climates have to be adapted to Canadian conditions. And we're taking that holistic One Health approach and trying to collaborate and coordinate where we can and as much as we can. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lees, for that informative overview of African swine fever. Next, we will hear from Kelly Sherman, Operations Supervisor with the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, and she will be presenting on the Canadian African Swine Fever Readiness and Wild Pig Strategy. That looks great, Kelly. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this and having so many great speakers. Yeah, so as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm the operations supervisor with the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. Today is a little bit different for me because I'm actually presenting on behalf of Animal Health Canada and the African Swine Fever Emergency Management Board. We're working with Animal Health Canada on some initiatives right now around Canada's wild pig strategy, and unfortunately they couldn't present, so I'm here to speak on their behalf. So I'm going to do my best. I'm going to probably speak pretty quickly because I have a lot of information, and then I have a contact at the end of my slide for any questions that I can answer. I can send you along to them. Just really quickly, just want to touch on who the Canadian Council on Invasive Species. We are a federally registered not-for-profit organization, most recently a registered charity as well. And we were created as a result of a multi-agency kind of Canada-wide meeting at the first National Invasive Species Forum, where collectively all agencies really called for a strong national and inclusive organization that could serve as a national voice and link the range of perspectives on invasive species across Canada. So I'm touching on two topics today: African swine fever preparedness for Canada, a really brief overview, and some information around Canada's wild pig strategy. So in terms of African swine fever preparedness, there is an African Swine Fever Emergency Management Board, a part of Animal Health Canada, that was initially brought together to develop and action the Pan-Canadian ASF Action Plan. So all partners are asked to come together to prevent entry and mitigate the impacts of any African swine fever potentially coming to Canada. So the emergency board is made up of a number of organizations that you can see there, and partners including industry, the federal government of Canada, provincial and territory governments, and ex officio members as well. So the action plan really has two main objectives, which is prevention and preparedness. And I'm going to go a little bit quickly. I don't want to go over my time too much. The plan itself has four main pillars. I'm going to quickly go through them. Pillar 1, enhanced biosecurity prevention, led by Canadian Pork Council. Pillar 2, preparedness planning, led by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Pillar 3, ensuring business continuity, led by the Canadian Meat Council. And Pillar 4, coordinated risk communication, which is led by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. So there's going to be quite a bit of text on these slides, but I'll kind of go through them briefly as I can and their objectives. So for Pillar 1, enhanced biosecurity and prevention, the goal of this pillar is to improve the level of biosecurity in the pork sector by updating the Canadian National Biosecurity Standards and developing a biosecurity benchmarking tool. Pillar 2, around preparedness planning, they have several subcommittees under this pillar to do a number of things, including validating the execution of the protocols of all African swine fever preparedness activities through tabletop exercises, drills, etc. Developing African swine fever surveillance recommendations to put forward to the ASF Emergency Management Board and guide the implementation of surveillance activities. Discuss options and approaches for large-scale depopulation, and develop recommendations for movement controls in the period between if a highly suspected or confirmed positive case of African swine fever and the time when the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has established the necessary movement controls. Moving on to Pillar 3, ensuring business continuity. The objective here is to develop a Canadian plan to outline regional differences and considerations dealing with the coordinated swine depopulation during the initial 6-month period if ASF is detected. Develop and implement an approach to ensure that Canada can rapidly zone and/or compartmentalize and ensure successful negotiation of zoning agreements with key trading partners. Discuss impacts to surplus healthy animals and potential short, mid to long-term federal, provincial, and territory governments and industry response and recovery efforts, and develop the national standard for ASF compartmentalization in Canada. And finally, Pillar 4, coordinated risk communication. Formalize the collaborative and multi-jurisdictional approach in the area of communications with regards to prevention and preparedness. So that's a really brief overview, and already there's been some significant accomplishments, which I'll quickly go through. So, which I just touched on, Canada does have a Pan-Canadian action plan for African swine fever, so that's a really big accomplishment and success. as well as a almost complete wild pig strategy, which I'll talk about after I'm through a couple more accomplishments. One of the other accomplishments is CanSpot ASF, which is a risk-based early detection testing program that works on the principle that, of course, the sooner we detect this virus once it arrives in Canada, the more we can limit its spread and respond to an outbreak. CanSpot ASF is available at approved Canadian Animal Health Surveillance Network laboratories and really is a program with the goal of early detection of ASF. It is to be used when ASF is not a main rule-out diagnosis and where early clinical signs of it could be masked by other routinely swine endemic viruses in Canada, and there's no charge to the producer or owner for testing. Another big accomplishment is the creation of a smallholder swine course for veterinarians. This course is able to prepare veterinary professionals to provide health services to smallholder swine producers. Topics include things like general health, production practices, approaching the diagnostic workup, and vaccination strategies. And as well, there is a draft Canadian swine depopulation methods reference document, which, like I said, the draft has been completed and now is with partners and stakeholders for feedback. And then last but not least is, which I think we all know is really important, is around communication, social media, and awareness. So there has been created a Don't Pack Pork Traveler Awareness campaign. So you can see there are some of the social media graphics and awareness materials created. Just some more pictures there. And then finally, just next steps and in progress. Again, I can't speak to all the specific details in this, but I will, like I said, leave a name for contact information or to contact with questions. But I know they are delving into some learnings potentially from artificial intelligence, preparing mental health supports to farmers if there is an outbreak, the Wild Pig Strategy Leadership Group, and Indigenous engagement, which I will talk on, potentially diving deeper into those depopulation issues. Of course, as we all know, when it comes to big issues like this, just further solidifying those roles and responsibilities and enhancing communication and awareness as well. Okay, moving on to Canada's Wild Pig Strategy. Again, I will be moving pretty quickly. CIS is involved in this because we recently acquired a contract through a partnership with Animal Health Canada to build a leadership group to guide the implementation of Canada's Wild Pig Strategy, develop a work plan for putting the strategy into action, and to find some funding to support this. So I just want to acknowledge all the predecessors who created and really started action on the strategy, as well as information around communications and reporting on wild pigs in Canada. Both Marnie Zimmer and Michelle Thompson were the predecessors and chaired the initial invasive wild pig working group, which accomplished a number of things, and including the realization of the strategy. And again, just thank you to all the organizations listed on the screen there that helped bring the strategy to fruition. So this is a really outdated map. I will preface that. And Canadian Council on Invasive Species also co-chairs the Transboundary Feral Swine Working Group with the Washington Invasive Species Council, and we are looking to update some of our mapping and create some kind of mapping protocols and that kind of thing. So I hope the next time I can present an updated map, but this just shows the feral swine are increasing in Canada. And a study from 2019 found that they are increasing by 9% per year. So that kind of gives just some context. I also really appreciate Wayne's presentation around One Health. This was in this presentation, but I took it out due to time. So that really helps set the context. So there's been quite a bit of work around kind of initial actions before the strategy and then the strategy itself. So Environment and Climate Change Canada supported the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative to chair and lead the first national group for invasive pigs in Canada. They instituted 2 working groups, strategic and operational, and then under each of those, there was 3 subgroups. Communications, which developed a national communications and outreach campaign. The disease surveillance subgroup, which developed a national sampling protocol for wild pigs, and the best practices management subgroup, which developed a document on best practices for wild pig management in Canada. So the strategic group also helped with developing a website and communication. So this is held on the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, and it gives a snapshot and overview of information pertaining to wild pigs across Canada. The operational group also brought together some representatives from different jurisdictions in a workshop to share technical information about things that are working and aren't working, and guest speakers were invited to present and answer questions, that kind of thing. This is a bit of a complicated slide, I will preface, but it's a reminder of how it all fits together. I think my brain is still working through it, but it just shows you here where it all started with the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative and those operational and strategic working groups, as I mentioned, and then those subgroups. So the ones to this is the yellow square. And then in the middle there, it's just showing the African Swine Fever Executive Management Board and talking about the ongoing wild pig strategy, and then the role of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as well. They are a key player and partner. So in terms of Canada's wild pig strategy, in the spring of 2021, the African Swine Fever Emergency Management Board tasked a new working group with developing a strategy for Canada. The goal was to bring together key partners to help inform wild pig management, decision-making in Canada, with the goal to facilitate an action agenda to prevent and mitigate social and ecological harm of invasive pigs. So currently, the draft strategy is complete. We're continuing to gather some Indigenous consultation, which is really important before it's finalized and put up on the Animal Health Canada website. But the leadership group has begun to be formed for this, which is being led by the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, to really start putting into action the strategy and implementing it. Just really quickly, there are 4 main components of the strategy: assembling leaders and partners, coordinating national cooperation, that kind of thing, gathering more data on the issue, and communicating about why it's important to take immediate action. So things like awareness, that kind of thing. Coordinating and building on existing activities to eradicate wild pigs, using experts to help tackle the issue as effectively as possible. And then really importantly, tracking the impact and success of the strategy. So just wanted to briefly touch on some of the learnings in terms of Indigenous collaboration and consultation. This has been really key to the strategy and will be key to making sure it's in the strategy and then published. But just some things that we have learned through Indigenous consultation on the strategy, just how important meaningful engagement and consultation is, but just little things like being specific in the strategy, which could apply to other strategies and other programs. So in Canada, we've through consultation learned that it's not just Indigenous, but it's First Nations and Métis. So recognizing the Indigenous groups within Canada, and even little things like recognizing their different terminology. So maybe not hunting, but harvesting, not wild pigs, but wild boar. So finally, just moving forward, continuing that First Nations and Métis engagement before we finalize and post the strategy. Also, we do want to translate the strategy as well before posting. Continuing moving forward with the leadership group, although the strategy is still a little bit draft, it is very near completion, and we do want to get going on moving forward with implementation and finding funding to support the implementation as well. And then continuing engaging with international groups, both Animal Health Canada and the Canadian Council on Invasive Species sit on the ad hoc trilateral feral swine working group and the transboundary feral swine working group as well. And this is just contact information, and Daniel Julian is the African Swine Fever project lead with Animal Health Canada, who could answer a lot of questions relating to the preparedness plan. That's it.
All right. Thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing the Canadian strategy with us. And next, we will hear from Vienna Brown, staff biologist with USDA's Wildlife Services National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. She will be sharing the United States Feral Swine Program and African Swine Fever readiness. Thank you so much, Vienna.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth, for the opportunity. Thank you all for your attendance. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all today about feral swine and our ASF preparedness from the state's perspective. So I'm sure everyone's aware, but just to make sure we're all starting on the same foundation, African swine fever virus was detected on the island of Hispaniola, which is comprised of Dominican Republic and Haiti. in July and September of 2021, respectively. Of course, that is the first time it's been in the Western Hemisphere in several decades, and it's very close, passingly close to both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which both have domestic and feral swine populations. So we have been doing a huge amount of work in the Caribbean territories as part of prevention and preparedness from an African swine fever perspective, and then as well as increasing both our operational footprint as well as our surveillance footprint in a handful of U.S. states that are deemed to be under particularly high risk. So for Puerto Rico, the feral swine issue in Puerto Rico is a little bit different than what we see in the rest of the US or Canada, where we think of they're an invasive species, but they behave very similarly to wildlife. They're out free ranging on the landscape. They are not interested in people, they're just out and about doing their thing and living, crepuscular or nocturnal lifestyle. In Puerto Rico, these, especially in the urban areas, we have urban feral swine problems. So these are primarily descendants of potbelly pigs that were imported from Vietnam as part of the pet trade. And then they're very cute when they're little and they get to be 150, 200, 250 pounds, and they're no longer appropriate for a household. So they were released onto the landscape. Hurricane Maria in 2017 really exacerbated that problem. And there is a very significant urban feral swine problem in Puerto Rico. They behave much more like other urban wildlife, like pigeons and other things like that, where they are really quite accustomed to humans and cars and traffic. They're on sidewalks and resting up against apartment buildings. It's been a really kind of unique opportunity to be working in Puerto Rico and managing these feral swine. It has required a fair amount of innovation, both for Puerto Rico as well as for the U.S. Virgin Islands for different reasons. But in terms of capturing these animals, translocating them, dispatching them, sampling, that sort of thing, since we can't obviously be doing that in a really urban setting. The Wildlife Services has been deploying personnel from within the agency for the last 18 months, both to Puerto Rico as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands. For Puerto Rico in specific, we've taken over 3,700 animals and sampled nearly 2,500 of them. So it's been a really significant lift. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, the feral swine numbers are much lower. In many cases, they're not even quote unquote feral swine, in that they do have owners, subsistence farmers and that sort of thing, or they just push through a fence or whatever it may be. So a lot of the work in U.S. Virgin Islands has been doing some reconnaissance on whether these are truly feral swine or if they're just loosely shepherded pigs in the landscape, getting those back to their respective owners or dispatching them if they are truly feral swine. But we've sampled a ton of pigs in the U.S. Caribbean territories of the U.S. as a part of early detection and as part of our preparedness activities for African swine fever. Within the continental U.S., there are 4 states, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, that are identified as very high risk for an ASF virus introduction. And this is specifically from Hispaniola. So this doesn't account for other endemic countries worldwide. So we're not looking at Africa or Asia, Eastern Europe. This is specifically looking at a risk of introduction from Hispaniola. And not surprisingly, these are all Gulf Coast states in the southern US, which are, of course, closest proximity to the island of Hispaniola. So we have ongoing surveillance activities for feral swine dispatched across the invaded range. We're looking at classical swine fever, swine brucellosis, and pseudorabies virus as part of our normal standard national surveillance activities. And then with the risk of African swine fever so close to the home front, we've included active surveillance for African swine fever in these 4 states. So the blue, orange, and red represent low, medium, and high priority counties for our normal national surveillance activities. And then the kind of muddy red-brown represents very high-risk counties, and these are associated with our ongoing active surveillance for African swine fever. For very high risk, kind of the factors that are being utilized, and we're very aware that there are very significant gaps in these data sets, but it's the best we can do to at least have some input into these models. So we're looking at the presence of landfills, seaports, and airports, the presence of domestic swine production. Of course, ASF is specifically a swine disease, so we're really interested in the presence of domestic swine production. And then we're also using data sets coming out of protection and quarantine, as well as customs and border protection, looking at passenger cargo and mail interdiction data from people and products coming from Hispaniola. And so we can determine where the risk of introduction would be based on what the product was that was illegally imported, where it was confiscated, and in the absence of that confiscation event, where the final destination would have been, which is where the risk of introduction would be. And so these 4 states pop up. We have a total of 79 very high-risk counties for African swine fever, and we have ongoing operational activities in 30 and change of those counties. We are doing active surveillance for both ASF and CSF in those very high-risk counties. So we're doing both PCR, so antibody antigen-based diagnostic, and then ELISA, so antibody-based diagnostic. So looking both for active infection as well as historical exposure to both of those viruses. And we are continuing to do our normal national surveillance activities and our normal surveillance activities in a subset of those animals. This is, I think this table is a couple weeks old now, but we've sampled over 2,000 animals in these 4 states for ASF and CSF, both PCR and ELISA. And the bold outline counties are those that are associated with being very high risk counties. And you'll notice we do have a handful of ASF and CSF, PCR and ELISA samples that are coming out of non-bolded counties. And those are associated with feral swine that are being dispatched along the border in non-very high priority counties that are adjacent to very high risk counties where pigs may be bed down and live their lives, but they'll drop into a city or a landfill or whatever it may be to feed during the night. And so we're also sampling those swine, since of course they're not adherent to their political boundaries at the county line. And so from a more global perspective, when we think about African swine fever and feral swine, the first big thing is going to be detecting the virus in the landscape. And so when we really got into the business of thinking about ASF and what that would look like and how we would want to think about that from a feral swine perspective, this predated the outbreak that's ongoing in Hispaniola. This really started in 2018, early 2019, when ASF showed up in China and spread throughout Southeast Asia and started moving into Western Europe. The viruses in the ASF viruses in those outbreak events were much more closely associated with the Caucasus 2007 isolate, which is super virulent. We saw nearly 100% mortality in animals that became infected with that virus. This is not what we're seeing in Hispaniola, which is distressing. I think when we were thinking about it 3 or 4 years ago, we're thinking there'll be a massive die-off event. We wouldn't be able to miss it between the scavenging activity and the smell and just the sheer number of feral swine that we would anticipate to see on the landscape. We really wouldn't be able to miss an African swine fever outbreak in feral swine, especially in a dense state. And I think based on what we're seeing coming out of the Dominican Republic in terms of mortality and morbidity in domestic swine populations, these viruses appear to be much less virulent. They've been being transmitted on that island for a while now and have attenuated to some degree. And so there's a lot more concern that we could have African swine fever virus on the landscape and not detect it for weeks to months. So again, that first big lift is just really detecting the virus on the landscape. And the next one, of course, is then determining the extent of spread and taking it slow and really doing some reconnaissance on where the virus is a super important part of a mindful, responsible outbreak response. Once, of course, we've detected the virus and determined the extent of spread, carcass removal, we know carcass-based transmission is a really important epidemiological pathway. So testing carcasses, removing those carcasses, and disposing of those in a way that really ends the virus life cycle is super important. It is a hemorrhagic virus. It is quite persistent, right? It's in every tissue. It's in blood. It is across the entirety of the carcass. Managing carcasses and carcass bits and environmental components are really important for ASFV management. And then, of course, doing drastic feral swine population reduction in either with convalescent animals and or naive animals, right? So just driving that population down, given that it's a density dependent disease. From a control area perspective, we're looking at a 3 to 5 kilometer control area around an infected premise, or in this case, either one animal as depicted in the left image where you have one animal carcass presumably on the ground, or a handful where you'd have the first 3 kilometers would be in the infected zone around that carcass. The next 2 kilometers would be the buffer zone. That first 5 kilometer ring represents the control area. And then you have another 5 kilometers around the first 5 kilometers, which represent the control zone, the surveillance area. And so that 10 kilometers is really what we're using as our response zone, if you will, around an infected carcass. Of course, what we would anticipate to see in an ASF outbreak is not just one 10-kilometer range, right? We'd have a whole bunch of concentric rings all stacked on top of each other. We wouldn't just find one sick or dead animal on the landscape. And so it would get quite complicated quite quickly. And so we have been really intentional about focusing on available tools as opposed to an exact response, right? There's so much variability across the landscape in terms of geography and season, difference in the seasons, feral swine densities, accessibility to those animals and that sort of thing. So we've been really focused on providing working within the available tools, and we would use this tool for this setting and that tool for that setting, but not dedicating, hey, on day 3, this is what we anticipate we'll do, or on day 7, this is what we'll be doing. We've also been focused pretty heavily on identifying gaps in supplies and knowledge. There's a lot of supply chain issues, even above and beyond those associated with COVID. And so we've been trying to get ammo and traps and that sort of thing all in the event of an ASF outbreak. We have a whole smattering of tools in the toolbox from a wildlife services perspective. I think many of these are similar across much of the feral swine and or wild boar invaded range. And then really thinking about a twofold scenario, right? So ASF being detected in domestic swine and trying to prevent spillover into feral swine populations, so that defend the premise, if you will, or feral swine being detected, African swine fever being detected directly in feral swine, and having that be part of a comprehensive multi-agency approach. So really been trying to focus in on how we anticipate managing those different scenarios and how they are similar and how they're different. With that, I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm very much out of time.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing the U.S. strategy with us. All right, we're going to transition now. Next, we will hear about feral swine damage management in Mexico from Luis Lucana, agricultural specialist with USDA APHIS Wildlife Services, Mexico. There we go. Awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for this important opportunity to show you what we are doing here in feral swine with the Mexican partners. It is a long period report since we started to work with the Mexican partners in 2015. When we started to work with them, we started to negotiate several agreements with the key institutions, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Health, for the potential impact that they have. But also, we bring a permanent communication, and we got an important support for the School of Veterinary Medicine and Animal Science for the National University, and was a key component of the negotiation and collaboration with Mexico. Based on that, we organized several workshops that were aided essentially in northern Mexico, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, and Sonora, but also with the people from the academics from the National University and with the Ministry of Natural Resources. We worked hard trying to explain what is the real impact of the feral swine population in the areas affected by that animal, and what are the essential activities for managing or damaging in US. And being absolutely honest, it was a really hard work that was essentially supported for the national plan of a national program of feral swine in the US. The group that was collaborating with Mexico was really important for us. And I want to thank once more for all their activities that they done with us. This is a general idea how many institutions, organizations, and collaborators we knock the door and receive any kind of support for different activities that we done in the first stage of the bilateral collaboration. As you can see, we are talking about, again, the Ministries of Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Health, and all the institutions, particularly the state institutions in the northern states initially, but also the associations of veterinarians, of producers, and hunting groups, but also some particular areas as the Myriad that I will discuss a little bit after during this session. And this is a general plan in 2015, 2016, where the feral swine was placed in Mexico. It is, as you can imagine, moving permanently, but we observed that the potential distribution for the feral swine was essentially based in the northern states of Mexico, but was perfectly possible to find them in any other areas in the country. And that was really interesting for us. As part of the permanent collaboration and negotiations with the Mexican partners, we got some important outcomes. The first one was a memorandum of understanding with the National University that gave us chances to develop several activities, included a couple of researches lines that are still in the process to be published thanks to the pandemic and many other things that happened here in Mexico. But that was the first collaborative effort and the collaborative document that we've done. Based on the meeting, the workshop in the Coahuila state, the government of Coahuila prepared this first, that was a initial plan, state plan for a particular effort for feral swine management in Coahuila. The same happened in Chihuahua state the following year, and it gives the opportunity to continue collaborating with all of them and the university, and we generate this, that was the first manual in sampling in feral swine. Unfortunately, it is just in Spanish, but it's an important references derivative of all the activities. And thanks to the meeting with the Minister of Natural Resources, we started to develop in 2017 a national plan for attention to the feral swine. It needs to continue working, and we are working with them. The idea is to take it again and continue collaborating with the Mexican partners. But also we collaborate with the USDA, with APHIS, in the biggest part of the Spanish translation of all the promotional materials and the biggest part of the banners and other materials that you can find in the APHIS website. The biggest part of the Spanish version that you will find there were prepared and worked here in Mexico in collaboration with the National Program of Feral Swine. And once again, I want to recognize and appreciate the permanent support of Dr. Dana Cole and all her team, but also to Mr. Mike Bodenchuk and Mr. Dave Berman for their permanent assistance and support in the collaborative efforts with Mexico. Without that value, it is impossible to work as the way that we are doing. Just to conclude and to show you in general what is going on here, in 2011, even in the middle of the pandemic status, we continue working with the Mexican partners, now with the Minister of Agriculture, and we developed, with the support of Dr. Peter Fernandez, that was an amazing value for us. We organized a couple of seminars about feral swine diseases, particularly the red diseases, with the Mexican partners of the National Commission for Eradication and Foot and Mouth Disease and other exotic diseases in Mexico. That were a couple of works online with the participation of the people of the university too, but we had close to 200 participants in each one of those seminars in 2001. And just the last year, we have a huge organization for collaboration with the Minister of Agriculture, again, particularly with the CPA Commission, and we worked together to advance in an agreement that both secretaries of agriculture from the US and Mexico have to start to discuss what would be the jointly efforts to support some kind of collaboration with the Españolas authorities to try to manage and to control the African swine fever in the potential risk of the arrival to the continental area. They are still working together. We are continuing supporting any meeting and any collaborative effort. And once again, the people from the office was a key participant in those activities, particularly Mrs. Rebecca Beach and again, Dr. Peter Fernandez. In general, the goals that we are having is to continue working with the Mexican counterparts and to try to develop all the materials, all the supportive activities, all the training, all the efforts to try to empower the bilateral relationship and to keep better understanding of the feral swine issues, particularly in the border, but extended to the other areas in Mexico. And now I want to present you just a little summary that the people from the CONAM presented in the last trilateral of conservation meeting. They describe it in general, where are having reports of feral swine in the municipalities of Mexico. As you can see in the map, the biggest part of the report are in the northern Mexico states. But particularly for CONAM, that this is the National Commission of Natural Protected Areas, they are focused in those areas with the presence of feral swine. And here, 3 areas are really important for the bilateral relationship with them. The Cañón de Santa Elena, that this is the border with Texas, the La Michililla in Durango, because they are the people who are developing more activities for feral swine control, and Laguna de Terminos in Campeche. And this is not because it's close to the border, but this is because this is a link with the rabies that I'm assuming that Davidman will mention in the coming presentation. As an example of the activities that they are developing, this is the map of Chihuahua State, and this is the estimation of the feral swine distribution in the state. And if you compare the maps for the previous years with this one, it's clear that the feral swine are extending the impact areas that they are having in Chihuahua State. And in general, this is the national update map developed in 2016 with the old systems to try to get any information about the feral swine. And this is the current status that we are trying to approach with bilateral efforts for collaboration. Here is some part of the activities that the Michililla Natural Protected Area are developing for feral swine control based on the training for the local people, capture of feral swine, and sharing information to keep all people know it about the potential risk in all the areas of the feral swine presence in Mexico. This is in general the way that we are continue working, and we hope to continue working with all partners in the Mexican agencies for sure. Finally, this is the specific support that the people from Durango in La Michililla are having for several organizations that are collaborating with them in the proposals and the financials and all the activities related with the feral swine management. And this is the goal that the CONAM is having to negotiate with the Mexican partners to keep the trilateral strategy for feral swine management, the technical and financial cooperation, the management and control workshops, and the exchange of scientific and management information for the feral swine control. And essentially, it is all what I have to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, for sharing the Mexican strategy with us. That was fantastic. Okay, next we're going to zoom out and learn about collaboration across the continent through the North American Feral Swine Working Group. Our next speaker is David Bergman, USDA APHIS Wildlife Services State Director in Arizona.
Thank you. Appreciate the invitation and including our group in the National Invasive Species Awareness Week and to talk about this very important and threatening topic of feral swine. So I do want to recognize our collaborative group encompasses Canada, Mexico, and the United States. You've heard from many of the speakers already today, and they are co-authors of this presentation. So feral swine issues are not unique to North America. It is a worldwide issue and one that we share, whether it's disease issues, disease threats, or damage. And there is a lot of opportunities where we can discuss across the borders ways that we can resolve each other's issues. But coming back to the speakers you heard today, they've all given you a good overview of issues each country is having and how they're working towards managing those issues. Canada, United States, and Mexico all have similar issues, similar problems, and they're not unique. Many of them pattern each other. Many of them look similar to each other, and there's many ways that we can share that information. But since they're not unique, these discussions have spilled over into a number of groups. And one of those groups where the discussions have started is the Trilateral Committee for Wildlife and Ecosystem Conservation and Management. The Trilateral is a group that meets annually. It is hosted by Environment Canada, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and SEMERNOT. It rotates from country to country each year, and they discuss issues of priority for all three countries, especially those that address conservation issues. A key to the trilateral is that it facilitates and enhances cooperation and coordination among the wildlife agencies of the three nations in projects and programs for the conservation and management of wildlife, plants, biological diversity, and ecosystems of mutual interest. The trilateral also facilitates the development of partnerships with other associated and interested entities. Delegations from each country come together annually for discussion on a wide range of topics, from joint on-the-ground projects to issues of law enforcement and the development of shared information databases. The group that was most interested in our topic was the Species of Common Conservation Concern Working Table, and their mission is to promote cooperative, comprehensive strategies and implementation of trilateral actions for the conservation of native wild plants and animals of concern and control of invasive species across North America. So based on discussions, looking at the issues each country is having and how they're addressing them, we received an invitation from the trilateral to present the topic initially during the week of May 17th, 2021. At that time, during the time constraints, it was presented as in conjunction with the rabies item, but there is some key ties between rabies and feral swine. So at the invitation of the trilateral, we started further discussions in North America with Canada, US, and Mexico. And during those discussions, it was decided we would begin an ad hoc North American feral swine wild pig working group to come together to build a collaborative effort to look at potential of a plan across North America. Our initial meeting was assisted by the trilateral in kicking it off and making sure we had the right initial players at the table. This is a picture from our first meeting where we had a discussion on where we would go. At that meeting, our initial discussion was to discuss current status of feral swine management issues and goals in each country. We agreed to work together to regularly share information and identify opportunities and challenges that impact each country, and to collaborate to identify potential shared strategies and partnerships. Since we held our meeting so late, we didn't have a lot of time to put together a joint session for the next trilateral. So the subsequent trilateral was the week of June 13th, 2022. We were invited back, and at that time, each country was bringing forward their issues with feral swine. So at the working table, we fit into a number of boxes within that table. And those include co-management, conservation of species with First Nations, urban conservation, mitigating and avoiding human-wildlife conflict, habitat restoration, invasive species management, using new technologies to solve issues with feral swine, as well as managing, mitigating, and understanding zoonotic diseases that can be facilitated by feral swine. Like I said, the first trilateral we came back to was within a month of our first meeting. So each country presented its shared overview and what they were doing specifically in those countries. They were tied together based on our discussions. And following each presentation, we had a joint question and answer session where all three countries came together and we worked together to facilitate the answers for the trilateral and show the unity that we were starting to build. We had a number of specific outcomes that we had asked for. Those all tie to what is needed in each country, but specifically, they can be boiled down to 4: trilateral strategy on feral swine management and control, technical and potential for financial cooperation plan for feral swine control, management and control workshops in high vulnerability areas, but in general, outreach throughout all three countries and exchange of scientific information on management and control for feral swine. Currently, the three countries are finalizing their terms of reference, so we are all on the same page and how we're going to work together. We have other information that is coming to play. We are looking at the North American Rabies Management Plan. This is a plan that's been presented to the trilateral since 2008, and it gives a good model for North America on an issue that covers all three countries. We are also looking at bringing in a variety of information resources, information from the U.S.'s National Feral Swine Damage Management Program, Canada's invasive wild pig strategy, distribution mapping from Mexico and the other countries as well. But in addition to that, we are reaching out to a number of groups, including the Transboundary Feral Swine Working Group with Canada and the US. You heard a little bit from Kelly Sherman today as well. And so those groups are feeding in. We will anticipate that we will have a number of experts in the world of feral swine management that will come to play on this ad hoc working group. Some may become permanent members, some will come in and fit in those pieces as we're putting together what will be a potential plan for North America. So that's a quick overview on where we are, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. Okay, our final presentation today is titled Squeal on Pigs, an Awareness and Reporting Campaign, and will be presented by Janine Neske, Biologist Extension Specialist with USDA APHIS Wildlife Services National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. Thank you, Janine.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I know our agency name is a mouthful, but you got it. I just have a quick little presentation here to wrap us up on an exciting new tool, or not even that new, but an exciting tool that we're really revamping to try to improve awareness and reporting. And this tool will be mostly used or most appealing to areas where we have fewer feral swine and you're trying to prevent introductions. This is pretty well covered in everyone's presentations today, but why is a transboundary effort needed? Feral swine, they don't care about our human-made borders. They're going to go where they want to go. The risk of foreign animal disease would have serious implications for any country that it was found in for their trade and for agriculture. And I think a real interesting piece of the puzzle with feral swine is that they often hitch a ride. They're good hitchhikers. They get a ride with folks. People bring them places they want to introduce them for hunting, which means we need to try to reach the public to convince them that's not a good idea. And really, it's going to take a collaborative effort. We need everyone across state borders, provincial borders, and national borders to work together to stop this invasive species. So this project kind of just came out of the Transboundary Working Group, which is, I'll give a quick little couple bullets here on our background. It first convened in 2020. It was in response to the Western Governors Association's Biosecurity Invasive Species Initiative. It really just aims to increase coordination among agencies. We want to improve monitoring efforts, help to establish reporting notification protocols, and just generally improve response control and management efforts. And this is, again, focusing on this began in northwestern states and provinces. However, moving forward, we hope to expand our reach. Let's reach eastward along the Canadian border and connect with folks down in Mexico and have it just be a North American effort. This is a big slide, but just to give you an idea of how many folks have already joined the Transboundary Working Group. And again, yeah, there's quite a few states on board and quite a few provinces on board. Now, what is this squeal on pigs thing we keep saying? It's an effort of the Transboundary Working Group to prevent introduction and spread of feral swine. It's already been in use in quite a few Pacific Northwest states and provinces, but the goal is to expand it. Some of the key players in this project so far have been the Canadian Council on Invasive Species, the Washington Invasive Species Council, who really was the first to even create this graphic and tagline, the Montana Invasive Species Council, and our National Feral Swine Management Program. So how are we going to be squealing on pigs? This project is an outreach, education, and public reporting campaign. We want to be developing, or we are developing, a media toolkit for managers. So basically the goal is to have tools that any agency or organization can take and they can plug and play the Squeal on Pigs campaign into their management efforts. To promote reporting, we're working on a mobile app and a website to allow for easy reporting of feral swine sightings. And we're also just working on facilitating knowledge exchange and collaboration between agencies across borders. So for example, Washington State had first developed this and they collaborate with British Columbia. So when pigs were seen near the border, both agencies on both sides of the border were notified that there had been a sighting of feral swine. So both could respond. Here's just a few fun examples of how squealing pigs has been used so far. We got like a nice big billboard up in, I think that's in Alberta. Yeah, that's in Alberta. And there's stickers and this is a tailgate wrap used by one agency, t-shirts, hats. Really, we're hoping to create the templates for all this type of stuff so that no one has to recreate the wheel and you can plug and play, download these templates and make them work for you in your management efforts. So again, what can the Squealin' Pigs program or do for your program? Here's some screenshots of just the app. So the app will allow for easy reporting. That will also allow you to have a photo uploaded. It'll have a location attached to it. I'm also working to create lots more materials. And we're not running huge printing. We're not keeping stacks of t-shirts or things like that, but we're just creating these templates so that your agency can use them and download these templates and create these products simply and easily. You don't have to go through getting a graphics artist to create all these things. And with that uniformity, we can get some better answers from the public. Along with all these products, we're going to have a brand guidance to help keep it so that everyone is using this in the same way and nobody, I don't know, turns the pig hot pink or something. Not that it would really matter too much, but it's just nice to keep that messaging uniform, I think, across wherever it's being used. And again, there'll be a website that will mirror the same information as the app. It'll allow for reporting to be submitted, but it'll also have a great directory where we'll have ideally a map where someone can just pop over to wherever their local agencies are that would be responsible for feral swine. Another fun little feature could be this app and the website could very easily be modified to be used as a tool in case of a foreign animal disease response. So yeah, like I said, I was going to keep it nice and short and sweet. If you are interested in using the Squealin' Pigs campaign in your feral swine management efforts, here's my contact info. We can leave this slide up for a minute maybe so everyone can remember it, or my info's in the bio. That's right. It'll be available associated with this. And I will yield the rest of my time to answer for other folks to answer questions and any discussions.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this has been such a great event. Thanks to everyone. Okay, I would like to invite our panelists to hop back on camera. We have just about 5 short minutes for questions, and we do have a number of questions. Thanks to our panelists that were answering them as we were going, and we will download the Q&A. So if we don't get to your question right now, we'll follow up. All right, so the first question at the top of the list, and anybody can answer this, whoever feels like they know it best, go ahead and jump in. Are there any updates on the effectiveness or problems encountered with using feed contraception to limit population growth of feral swine?
I guess let's take a stab at it. There is a product out. It's called Hog Stop. It's neither endorsed nor discouraged by APHIS. We weren't involved in the production of that. But I think Gossipol is the active chemical in there, and there's been shown to be some impacts to fertility. But there's not been enough research out there, I guess, to prove it as an effective deterrent to population growth.
Okay, thank you so much. What can homeowners do to keep feral swine off of their property? Does anything work other than putting up a fence, and do fences even work?
We encourage basically integrated wildlife damage management. A lot of our tools are a lethal tool, but certainly barriers can have some impact. However, fencing is very inefficient sometimes at stopping pigs. They can go under it, and so it would take an effective fence. But certainly there are some barriers out there that could deter access to a lawn per se, but really the removal of swine themselves, I guess, is the only true deterrent.
Okay, very good. Do we have estimates of the wild population of feral pigs across North America and the harvest amounts?
Yeah, I'm not for sure that anyone tracks that. We keep some internal records, but there's certainly a lot of feral swine harvested opportunistically during deer seasons. And we know that there are active hunting groups and stuff. And I don't know if Dave knows from a state perspective how that's maybe monitored, but we don't keep records.
I think part of the problem is in a lot of states, or no problem, but the reason this isn't really documented is that a lot of states call them a nuisance species. They don't need a tag. There really is no reporting on their harvest. Yeah.
Yeah, those are good points. Thank you. Okay.
One comment I might offer though is, how do we actually estimate a population in the wild? That's a really big question, and I don't have any answers on how we do that.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's wrap it up and let's talk about hunting for just a quick moment. We've had several comments in the chat and in the Q&A about how hunting fits into the control of wild pigs. And I know that there's a diverse set of perspectives on that depending on where you're at and what laws and regulations enable. But from this group, I know Squeal on Pigs, it says don't shoot, report. So let's talk about that for just a minute. Whomever would like to open that up.
I want to throw in there, historically, the states that, have restricted hunting have been some of the most successful in actually eliminating swine. If you have swine on the landscape and you allow hunting, it incentivizes their existence. A lot of times hunters are after trophy animals. They don't want to take the females because those help to reproduce and says maintain the population. So we don't see it as an effective tool. We certainly don't discourage people from shooting swine if they have the opportunity, but I don't think hunting is going to get us out of this problem.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? All right, we are right at the top at the end of our webinar time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thanks to those of you that hung in. This was just an absolutely phenomenal event. I want to thank each of our panelists, the various groups that helped us organize and put this event together today, and of course, Washington Invasive Species Council for sponsoring today's webinar. We hope that you are enjoying National Invasive Species Awareness Week and taking advantage of all of the great tools available at NISAW.org. And tomorrow's event is titled American Bullfrog Management to Support Conservation and Recovery of Native Species in the West. We hope to see you there. And with that, we will conclude today's NISAW event. Thanks everyone for participating and have a great day.